Absolutely.
Absolutely. Used to emphasize that something is completely true. For example, you're absolutely right.
Accept. To take willingly something that is offered, to say yes to an offer, invitation, etc. For example, he asked me to marry him, and I accepted. Accessible. That can be reached, entered, used, seen, etc. For example, the remote desert area is accessible only by helicopter.
Accidentally.
Accidentally. By chance, in a way that was not planned. For example, as I turned around. Accurately. In a way that is correct and true in every detail. For example, the article accurately reflects public opinion.
Acid. A chemical, usually a liquid, that contains hydrogen and has a pH of less than 7. The hydrogen can be replaced by a metal to form a salt. Acids usually have a bitter sharp taste and can often burn holes in or damage things they touch. For example, the acid burned a hole in her coat. Actual. Used to emphasize something that is real or exists in fact. For example, James looks younger than his wife, but in actual fact, equals really, he is 5 years older.
Actually. Used in speaking to emphasize a fact or a comment, or that something is really true. For example, what did she actually say?
Addition.
Addition. A thing that is added to something else. For example, all of these technologies are fairly recent additions.
Additionally. In a way that is more than was first mentioned or is usual. For example, additionally.
Address.
Address. To think about a problem, or a situation, and decide how you are going to deal with it. For example, address something.
Admit.
Admit. To agree, often unwillingly, that something is true. For example, it was a stupid thing to do.
Advantage. A thing that helps you to be better or more successful than other people. For example, a distinct or significant, a huge advantage.
Affair.
Affair. Events that are of public interest or political importance. For example, world, international affairs.
Aftermath.
Aftermath. The situation that exists as a result of an important and usually unpleasant event, especially a war, an accident, etc. For example, in the aftermath of something.
Afterwards.
Afterwards. At a later time, after an event that has already been mentioned. For example, afterwards she was sorry for what she'd said. Ally. A country that has agreed to help and support another country, especially in case of a war. For example, our European and NATO allies.
Alternative.
Alternative. That can be used instead of something else. For example, the road was closed, so we had to find an alternative route.
Ambition.
Ambition. Something that you want to do or achieve very much. For example, she had fulfilled her lifelong ambition.
Amendment. A small change or improvement that is made to a document or proposed new law, the process of changing a document or proposed new law. For example, to introduce/propose/table an amendment, equals to suggest it. Announcement. A spoken or written statement that informs people about something. For example,
To make an announcement.
Anonymous. With a name that is not known or that is not made public. For example, an anonymous donor.
Answer. To say, write, or do something as a reaction to a question or situation. For example, I repeated the question.
Apology. A word or statement saying sorry for something that has been done wrong or that causes a problem. For example, to offer / make / demand / accept an apology.
Appeal.
Appeal. A deeply felt request for money, help or information that is needed immediately, especially one made by a charity or by the police. For example, appeal for something.
Arguably.
Arguably. Used, often before a comparative or superlative adjective, when you are stating an opinion that you believe you could give reasons to support. For example, he is arguably the best actor of his generation.
Arrangement. A plan or preparation that you make so that something can happen. For example, travel and accommodation arrangements have been finalized.
Array. A group or collection of things or people, often one that is large or impressive. For example, a vast array of bottles of different shapes and sizes. Ash. The gray or black powder that is left after something, especially tobacco, wood or coal, has burnt. For example, cigarette ash.
Assertion. A statement saying that you strongly believe something to be true. For example, he was correct in his assertion that the minister had been lying.
Assume.
Assume. To think or accept that something is true, but without having proof of it. For example, assume that.
Audio. Connected with sound that is recorded. For example, audio and video recordings files clips.
Backdrop. Everything that can be seen around an event or scene. For example, the mountains provided a dramatic backdrop for our picnic. Backup. Extra help or support that you can get if necessary. For example, the police had backup from the army.
Backwards. Towards a place or position that is behind. For example, I lost my balance and fell backwards.
Ban. An official rule that says that something is not allowed. For example, a smoking ban. Ban. An official rule that says that something is not allowed. For example, a smoking ban.
Bare. Not covered by any clothes. For example, she likes to walk around in bare feet.
Barely. In a way that is just possible but only with difficulty. For example, he could barely read and write.
Barrier.
Barrier. An object like a fence that prevents people from moving forward from one place to another. For example, the crowd had to stand behind barriers.
Basically.
Basically. In the most important ways, without considering things that are less important. For example, I think we are basically saying the same thing.
Because.
Because. For the reason that. For example, I did it because he told me to.
Bell. A hollow metal object, often like a cup in shape, that makes a ringing sound when hit by a small piece of metal inside it, the sound that it makes. For example, a peal of church bells rang out in the distance.
Benchmark.
Benchmark. something that can be measured and used as a standard that other things can be compared with. For example, tests at the age of 7 provide a benchmark against which the child's progress at school can be measured.
Benefit.
Benefit. An advantage that something gives you, a helpful and useful effect that something has. For example, freedom of information brings great benefits.
Besides.
Besides. Used for making an extra comment that adds to what you have just said. For example, I don't really want to go. Besides.
Better.
Better. Of a higher standard or less poor quality, not as bad as something else. For example, we're hoping for better weather tomorrow.
Bin. A container that you put waste in. For example, a rubbish bin.
Block.
Block. To stop something from moving or flowing through a pipe, a passage, a road, etc. by putting something in it or across it. For example, after today's heavy snow. Bold. Brave and confident, not afraid to say what you feel or to take risks. For example, it was a bold move on their part to open a business in France. Book. A set of printed pages that are fastened inside a cover so that you can turn them and read them. For example, his desk was covered with piles of books.
Boundary. A real or imagined line that marks the limits or edges of something and separates it from other things or places, a dividing line. For example, after the war the national boundaries were redrawn.
Breach. To not keep to an agreement or not keep a promise. For example, the government is accused of breaching the terms of the treaty.
Breakthrough. An important development that may lead to an agreement or achievement. For example, to make or achieve a breakthrough.
Bullet.
Bullet. A small metal object that is fired from a gun. For example, he was found to have a single bullet wound in his chest.
Bureaucracy. The system of official rules and ways of doing things that a government or an organization has, especially when these seem to be too complicated. For example, unnecessary or excessive bureaucracy.
Bat. Used to introduce a word or phrase that contrasts with what was said before. For example, I got it wrong. It wasn't the red one but the blue one.
Button.
Button. A small round piece of metal, plastic, etc. that is sewn onto a piece of clothing and used for fastening two parts together. For example, British English.
Cancel.
Cancel. To decide that something that has been arranged will not now take place. For example, all flights have been cancelled because of bad weather.
Candle. A round stick of wax with a piece of string, called a wick, through the middle that is lit to give light as it burns. For example, a flickering candle.